Final Fantasy has, as a series, never been static. So far, we have examined two games. The original Final Fantasy laid down the basic foundation for everything that would come after. The sequel, Final Fantasy II, began the signature experimentation of the series, primarily by transforming the progression system from the typical blanket levelling to one where individual aspects of a character improve independently. The next entry, and the focus of this episode, Final Fantasy III, would show that the series doesn't necessarily have to always go forward. Many of the features from Final Fantasy II were absent. Indeed, Final Fantasy III has more in common with the first game than its sequel. And yet, experimenting with the original formula is still a core component of this game. The biggest of these experiments has returned to the series on multiple occasions, so one would assume that Final Fantasy III made quite an impression. But how does it compare to its predecessors? And is it a good game in 2020? We'll try to find out as I continue my adventure through Final Fantasy from the top. Final Fantasy III was first released in 1990, exclusive to the Famicom in Japan. That would be the game's only release for 16 years. Where its predecessors got a US release or Japanese ports in the years between their initial releases and the early 2000s, Final Fantasy III was only ever released on the Famicom. It grew to become almost mythical in Western markets, particularly once the original numbering scheme was adopted internationally. By 2003, the whole world had access to Final Fantasies 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 and 10. Number 3 remained absent, but not for too long. A little over a year later, it was announced that Final Fantasy III was on its way to all corners of the world. But this would be no simple port with shinier graphics and cleaner sound. In 2006, Final Fantasy III arrived on the Nintendo DS, remade from the ground up. Now with 3D models instead of sprites, this version was designed to take advantage of the features of the DS. And yet, Square Enix still endeavoured to keep the core of the gameplay as close to the original as possible. This approach was, for the most part, a success. Long-time RPG fans loved the game, and though there were some complaints about difficulty and old-fashioned gameplay, in general the game was well received, selling almost 2 million copies. All future releases would use this version as their basis, with very few differences beyond improvements to resolution and sound quality. The first port was to iOS, and did make one change beyond basic presentation concerns. Without the Nintendo Wi-Fi connection, some side quests would be unavailable, so these were altered to unlock under certain conditions instead. This would be carried over to future ports. The Android version would follow soon after, with the PSP version not too far behind. The PSP version was download only in the West, and included a feature that surprisingly didn't cause much controversy: Auto Battle. It isn't quite a straight up win button, all it does is repeat the last action taken, which makes grinding much less of a chore, and if you fail to pay attention, can in fact be detrimental in some battles. The final version of note is the release on PCs through Valve's Steam client in 2014. Initially, this version was not regarded in a great light. Very minimal improvements to graphics, a fair incidence of bugs, and poor interfaces designed around touch were all common reports. In a way, the PC release has many of the problems that affect the smartphone versions of the first two games. With one big difference: the word has is now had. In February 2020, a huge, metaphorically at least, patch was released, fixing many of the bugs and vastly improving the graphical capabilities, especially for resolutions beyond HD such as 4K or ultra-wide 21:9 screens. This update also rearranged the interfaces, making them far more controller and keyboard friendly, while mouse and touchscreen support were added too, a boon for those with tablets that run regular Windows. The PSP's auto battle was also included in the update. The Android and iOS versions got a very similar update around this time, cleaning up the visuals on newer smart devices and improving controller support as well, plus auto battle too. Effectively, at this point the iOS, Android and Steam versions are almost identical, visually and functionally. I played the game on the PC release as the most up-to-date and easiest to capture. I also sampled the DS version, but given the closely ported nature of intervening releases, I won't cover them in any particular detail. Due to the Famicom version's exclusivity, I won't be covering it in depth, but will mention anything of particular relevance. As always, we'll look at the gameplay first. Like the previous entries, the core gameplay loop is still predicated on exploring the overworld, visiting towns and dungeons while getting into turn-based fights. The biggest change for Final Fantasy III is the introduction of the job system. This job system has wide-ranging effects that cover many of the gameplay systems. We'll start with the battle system. Like last time, if I don't mention something, assume it to work like previous games. When you enter a battle, you will see the classic lineup, party on one side, enemies on the other. The modern version only allows up to 3 individual enemies, a big change from the NES's potential max of 8. However, balance has been maintained by giving the enemies fairly significant buffs. Rows return, though only for the player's party in the modern version. Here, back row party members can still be targeted and can attack physically themselves. However, they will take and deal reduced damage with most weapons. New to this game is that you can change the row of a character on their turn, though the action does cost the turn. Keep in mind that being ambushed, a back attack as it is called here, will start the battle with your back row in the front row, and vice versa, with the enemies getting a free turn to boot, so it would be wise to keep your team healthy. Once you're in a battle, you get to choose an action, and this is where the job system starts to come into play. 6 of the actions are common to almost all jobs, with some jobs providing upgraded versions. Attack is an obvious physical attack. Guard is the defend of this game, reducing damage taken for the turn. Item lets you use items from the inventory or utilise the abilities of equipped items. Equipment allows you to change the equipped items mid-battle without costing a turn either. Front or rear is the command to switch rows. And runaway attempts to escape the battle. The second option in the list is generally the current job's special ability. Some of them are exclusive to a specific class, such as the Dragoon's Jump or the Bard's Sing, while others are multi-class, such as Magic. I'll go into more detail about job abilities shortly. In regards to Magic, in this game it utilises the Spell Charge MP system of the early versions of Final Fantasy I. Most spells can multi-target, but not all. Like before, multi-targeting will reduce the damage against each individual enemy. Battles themselves progress much like the previous entries. Once you've selected your actions, the enemies select theirs. I couldn't find specifics, but it seems to work in the same way as 2, where action selection is effectively random from a weighted list of possible actions. One big change on enemy actions is bosses. Almost all of them get at least 2 actions per turn. We'll discuss them in more detail later. Lastly, turn order. In general, it works much like Final Fantasy II, using agility and various equipment stats to get a baseline speed. Like that game, each turn a random number is added to this baseline to keep things interesting. However, there is an additional factor this time. Action selection matters. Some magic spells and abilities have a hidden speed penalty attached, especially those that are particularly powerful. Others get boosts to their position in the turn order. For example, Sing, the signature ability of the Bard, almost always goes first, which actually makes the Bard phenomenally useful. Let's look at the jobs in a bit more detail. The biggest thing that separates the job system from the class system of old is that you can change jobs anytime you are not actively engaged in a battle. Find yourself in need of some more magic power for a certain dungeon? Just change a warrior into a black mage and get ready to fire off spells. Flying enemies getting you down? Changing to a dragoon will help you clip their wings. You can have more than one character occupying the same job too. Start your own band by turning everyone into bards. Or go pillaging with a squad of Vikings. That's not to say there is no downside. When you change job, you will receive a stat penalty for anywhere up to 10 battles, partially based on how different the new job is to the old one, but also reliant on job level too. You will also not gain any missing MP, you must restore that separately. Not all jobs are available at the start either. Technically, only Freelancer is available at the very start, but you do quickly unlock a basic 6, and then gradually acquire the others in chunks as you progress through the story. There are 23 jobs in total, which can be split into 3 general categories: physical jobs, magical jobs, and specialist jobs. Physical jobs are the majority, with many of them having access to different selection of weapons and having different abilities that separate them from the other fighters. The Freelancer is the starting job. With access to first level magic of both flavours, they can also equip a decent variety of weapons, but their stats let them down later in the game. Warriors get plenty of weapon options and have the Advance skill, which lets them deal more damage but also take more damage if they get hit. Monks fight with their hands and have access to Retaliate, which allows them to deal out heavy counterattacks, with the downside that the enemy has to actually attack the monk first. The Thief is finally able to steal, and they get an enhanced runaway in the form of Flee. They mainly fight with daggers. Knights are a useful class, using only swords and shields. They get access to first level white magic and the Defend skill, which will take physical damage for other party members. As a bonus, Defend triggers automatically if a party member has critical health. The Ranger job attacks from range with bows or thrown weapons. Barrage allows them to multi-target all enemies with reducer damage on each and a larger cost of arrows. Vikings use hammers and axes and can utilise the Provoke skill to force enemies to target only the Viking. Dragoons are limited to spears and have the Jump ability. This lets them evade attacks for a turn and then strike the enemy for 1.5 to 2 times damage depending on the job level. Dark Knights wield swords or dark blades and use the Soul Eater ability to deal decent damage to all enemies at the cost of some of their own HP. Black Belts prefer to be unarmed. Their boost ability lets them charge up for a turn to dish out greater damage. The Ninja job can use swords, daggers, dark blades and thrown weapons. Their special skill, Throw, lets them throw an item, losing it permanently but potentially dealing massive damage. The magical jobs all focus on casting spells. As mentioned earlier, they use the spell charges system of the first game, though it is considerably more forgiving, as you can have more than 9 charges per spell level. The White Mage job ought to be familiar by now. They can use up to level 7 white magic and can wield staves and some rods, which may be able to cast certain spells for free from the item menu. Black Mages should likewise be familiar. With up to level 7 black magic, they too can use staves and rods, but also have access to some early bows if you need additional damage from the back row. The Red Mage is another classic job. Levels 1 to 5 of both schools of magic, they also have a range of weapon options. Devouts are like upgraded white mages. They can use all white magic and have an MP curve that is better suited to the higher levels. The Mage's job is its black magic counterpart, with all black magic spells and a similar MP curve. The last 3 magical jobs all utilise a new form of magic. This game was the birthplace of summons in Final Fantasy. In brief, each summon has 3 possible effects that can be considered a white magic effect, a black magic effect, and an ultimate effect. Which effect is used can depend on the job of the character that cast the summon. They use MP in the same way as black and white magic. Evokers can cast all the summons, but the effect will be randomly selected from the white or black options. Summoners will always use the ultimate effect, which is often a very high damage elemental attack. Sages are the jack of all wizardry. They summon like the evoker, randomly using a white or black effect, but also have access to all black or white magic as well. The downside with them is they have a much more limited pool of MP. The final category of jobs is the specialists. These all have skills that don't really fit into the other categories. Scholars can use their study ability to scan the enemy, showing HP and any weaknesses. They also get doubled effects from items and can use levels 1 to 3 of each magic school, though they have a small MP pool. Geomancers are an interesting job. Terrain is their special skill, a magical attack that depends on the current location for its element and targeting properties. Bards are also unique. They can use different harps to sing different songs. There are only 5 songs. 1 heals the party, 1 damages the opponent, and the rest provide buffs that last for 2 turns. Songs almost always act first, so combining that with being able to change equipment freely makes the Bard surprisingly strong when they are at full power. If you've been counting, you may be thinking I've gotten something wrong. Actually, there is one last hidden job, the Onion Knight. This was actually the default class in the Famicom version, but was replaced by the Freelancer in the remake. It has access to almost all but the most special weapons, and can use any black or white magic in the game. The drawback is that Onion Knights have very poor stats until they reach a very high character level. Let's initiate a segue into the stats. The basic array of stats is fairly consistent with what came before, though with some different names. We have the 5 core stats that are determined by the character's level and the current job. Strength, which is linked with attack power and damage dealt. Agility, which decides number of hits, turn order and attempts to escape battle. Vitality reduces damage taken and increases HP gained on level up. Intellect influences black magic, while Mind influences white. There are also 3 other stats that take equipment into account. Attack mixes strength with the attack rating of equipped weapons. Defense is calculated from armor ratings and vitality. Magic defense is based on armor ratings. We've already mentioned that MP uses the spell charge system. The actual quantity of charges per level is, like the core stats, based upon character level and current job. HP works like it always does, though it differs from most other stats in that it remains the same when you change jobs, something that you may need to keep in mind when selecting jobs. These are not the only things which affect your effectiveness in combat though. Characters have a hidden melee proficiency for each hand. This gradually increases as you use physical attacks, and is a permanent element of the character. A character that has used physical jobs for most of the game will hit harder than a character with an identical job and levels who has spent most of the game as a mage. The job level itself also has a large influence on combat capability, potentially even more than the other individual statistics at certain points in the game. It can also increase the effectiveness of certain abilities, such as the Bard's Healing Song, restoring around 10% of health at job level 0, up to nearly 20% at job level 100. Always remember, job level is distinct from character level, though both are important. They also level up in different ways. We'll start with character level. This operates like it did in the original Final Fantasy, using classic experience points as its method of progression. Defeating monsters will grant characters a certain amount of experience. At certain milestones, the character will gain a level. This is where we diverge from the first game though. In that game, the act of gaining a level increased stats. Not so here. I mentioned earlier that the main stats are determined by the character's level, but also by the current job. Each job essentially has its own stat table, so your base stats will always be those that correspond to your current level on the current job's stat table. Any two characters of the same level and job will have the same base stats. The job themselves obviously have stat tables that follow their function. Physical jobs have high strength, white mages have higher mind, while black mages have higher intellect. The thief job focuses on agility, while the black belt grants the greatest vitality. This is the one stat that may have consequences though. HP is the only stat that remains constant across jobs, and is also the only stat that is increased by the act of gaining a level. The amount of HP gained is based upon the current vitality, hence potential consequences. If you have a party member who has occupied a low vitality job for much of the game, they will have considerably less HP than a character that has been a high vitality knight or black belt. There is a way to rectify this. Simply change the low HP character to a black belt, and with a few levels they can be approaching similar HP totals. Just remember that while a black belt, you will be leveling that job rather than your main one. As stated earlier, job level is important for combat effectiveness. It increases in a way that is similar in concept to Final Fantasy II's practice makes perfect progression system, though much more sensible in execution. To increase in job level, you must earn 100 job points. You earn job points by taking any action in combat other than run away or flee. Each job has different rates of progression by conferring on the player different amounts of job points for taking an action. For example, a thief will earn 18 job points for an action, while a black mage will only earn 10. The game does give you a hand when changing to a new job though. Up to job level 14, all jobs will grant at least 20 job points for an action, to help get that job up to speed a little quicker. It's worth taking note that job points are totally independent of the enemy you face. A low level goblin or a high level dragon will still provide the same job points per action. This makes job level somewhat easy to grind, though potentially rather tedious. Going into battle against a goblin and using guard 10 times before attacking will gain you a job level, but is hardly mentally stimulating. But the system is flexible enough that you can tailor job level grinding to your own desires. Grinding is occasionally necessary in this game, as I'll discuss more when I talk about dungeons, but it is much less of a chore than in some games, especially with the auto battle feature, which doubles the speed of combat when active. Purists may consider its use bad form, but if you only have limited time for gaming, it's a very welcome addition. I really did enjoy the gameplay in Final Fantasy III. The core of combat still uses the foundation from the original Final Fantasy, and is still as solid. If anything, combat here is the best of the three 8-bit based titles. It's simple to control and understand, while still offering plenty of depth for those who like to experiment or challenge themselves. The job system is reasonably intuitive, and for the most part you are free to form your party in whichever way you want. The range of different jobs caters to many different playstyles and party compositions, while the flexibility offered by the ability to change job as you wish with very minimal punishment is great if the game ever starts to feel stale. Split progression between character level and job level is psychologically satisfying, with the fairly consistent rate of advancement triggering that small rush that so many mobile games like to abuse for monetization, just without the abuse. It also gives the sense of learning individual skills while still growing as a character. So, we've established that battles are fun. What about the world? The overworld may seem quite small when you first get the chance to actually explore a wider area. There's a decent number of towns and a fair amount of dungeons, but it doesn't take very long at all to travel from one edge of the world to the other. And then you find out you're actually on the floating continent, and there is quite a lot more world out there. The world beneath has 3 main continents and is in many ways reminiscent of the overworld of Final Fantasy. But not really in a good way, to be honest. The vast majority of the towns and other points of interest are in the starting area, this time the floating continent, and the rest of the world is comparatively barren. Pixel for pixel, the floating continent is around 1/3 of the total playable world, yet it contains almost 2/3 of the points of interest. I can understand the reasoning. Much like the first game, once you have control of an airship, you can travel around so much quicker that the actual time between locations is similar. It's still disappointing though, to have this whole new huge world to explore, only to discover that there is very little to actually do in it. Vehicle-based gatekeeping returns with a vengeance in this title, and often it only serves to make the flaws of the lower world even starker. We'll start with the basics. The canoe returns, still serving the same function, but it is only necessary once or twice. By the time you come across other rivers, you can usually just fly over them. You gain access to the ship, the Enterprise, a few hours into the game. It allows your party to disembark anywhere they can walk, just like the ship in Final Fantasy II. What separates the Enterprise from Final Fantasy II's ship is that towards the end of your time on the floating continent, it becomes an airship too. Final Fantasy III loves airships. You will have flown 4 of them by the end game. They each have different abilities and landing requirements. One thing they have in common is that none of them can traverse the tall mountains. They can fly up to a floating continent high in the sky, but not over a few big hills. The first airship belongs to Cid. Yep, another one, cementing the name's usual association with airships. It is the classic format of airship from previous games, but is promptly sacrificed to let you out of the starting area and into the greater floating continent map. The second is the aforementioned Enterprise. Once it becomes an airship, the Enterprise acts similar to Cid's airship, with basic functionality, except it must land on water instead of the ground. The Nautilus is the third airship. This one is a high-speed vessel, even able to fly against strong winds. Later, it also gets the ability to dive underwater, becoming a submersible. The final airship is the Invincible. This ship is constantly in the air. Rather than landing, your party simply uses a ladder. This is partly because you can actually do things on board the Invincible. It provides a few shops, an inn, and more on board. In addition, this airship can fly over very specific shorter mountains, which are few in number and are very obvious roadblocks. Not inherently a bad thing, but it develops into frustration in a few areas, where you must hop over a dozen such mountains to actually reach a dungeon. It is another mark against the design of the lower world. There is one final transport option, returning from Final Fantasy II. The Chocobo. Our big yellow friends return, this time with 11 different Chocobo Woods as starting points. Rideable Chocobos are the same as last time. They are fast and avoid random encounters, but the Chocobo Woods also contain an extra element. With an offering of Gysahl Greens, you can call the Fat Chocobo the king of the Chocobos and effectively a storage chest for items you don't want to carry with you, but also don't want to sell. While fun, the rideable Chocobos are, again, not really worth going out of your way for. Airships are too prevalent, and often, especially on the lower world, you will need to pass obstacles that the Chocobos cannot, like mountains or the ocean. As I said earlier, the lower overworld is just a bit disappointing. I feel like the developers wanted to create a world with epic scope, which they undoubtedly did. What they failed to do was actually fill it with content. Discounting the amount of water and uncrossable mountains, the actual content area of the lower world is barely larger than that of the floating continent, and that area is often empty of actual content. It doesn't totally ruin the overworld design. The floating continent itself is solid. Unfortunately, it sets expectations that the lower world does not meet. Another aspect that is more like the first game is towns. In Final Fantasy III, most of the towns have their one particular thing, be it a story event or a particular focus of their shops. There are some that are more like the towns of Final Fantasy II, such as Canaan, which has some NPC homes with a bit more backstory to them, but the majority feel like they exist only to provide the usual services and to point you towards the next objective. They don't feel like real living places. This isn't helped by the way the narrative plays out. I'll cover it in more detail later, but as far as towns are concerned, they often feel too disconnected from each other. An NPC will occasionally mention a different town, if that is where you need to go next, but it could be on the other side of the galaxy for all of the interplay between towns there is. Service-wise, towns predominantly feature the same services as they did in Final Fantasy II. Weapon, armour and magic shops work the same. Inns often feature the general goods store within them, instead of being two separate buildings. Sanctuaries have been replaced with springs, though some of these springs do appear in dungeons, and not all springs work the same. Some will recover HP and MP, others will heal status ailments, and the third type works like the sanctuaries from previous games. The trouble is that you can't actually tell the difference between them. You might be a man down, visit a spring, then head into a battle without paying attention or checking, to discover you still only have 3 fighters, but at least they are healthy. Generally, if there is an inn in the town, the spring will most likely revive fallen party members, but not always. The towns are distinct enough that you're unlikely to confuse any two when you're within them, but the vast majority just aren't that memorable. You'll be thinking of a particular item that a certain town sells, but not remember which of these small towns on the map it is, forcing you to fly back and forth visiting all of them. Dungeons, at least, are somewhat more memorable. While there is a reasonable amount of asset crossover between dungeons, good old palette swapping helps to differentiate elements and gives each dungeon a distinctive aesthetic. Exploring strikes a reasonable balance between the first 2 titles. Dungeon floors are reasonably compact for the most part, though some stretching out does occur to keep things fresh. Treasures are often found at the end of dead ends, providing reward for exploration without any of them infuriating monster closets. The length of dungeons has also been scaled back, and floors themselves are often quicker to traverse. This results in dungeons never feeling like they've overstayed their welcome. The encounter rate helps, feeling fairly well balanced overall. There is a high degree of variance. Sometimes you'll have 3 or 4 encounters really close together, then you can go through an entire floor without having to fight. It becomes more noticeable depending on what you're doing at the time. If you are trying to rush the boss, you will notice the strings of encounters more readily. If you are dedicating a session to grinding, you'll feel like dungeons are empty. It seems to be a matter of perception, which usually means things are pretty well balanced. On the subject of grinding, I did mention its occasional necessity. This is mainly due to what awaits at the end of dungeons. Bosses. In Final Fantasy III, bosses are tough. Maybe even too tough at times. They represent less a slight difficulty increase as the culmination of the dungeon, and more a big step up in challenge that wasn't particularly broadcast. Not only do most of them get to attack at least twice each turn, but they are often orders of magnitude stronger than anything you faced in the rest of the dungeon. The difficulty of the bosses is a common complaint about the game. and this is certainly not helped by the fact that all versions use the classic saving system. You can only save on the overworld. When it comes to dungeons, you can use the quick save, but using it kicks you to the title screen, and once you load the save it will disappear. So if you lose, you do have to go to a pre-dungeon save file. Therefore, a little grinding is often wise, else you may end up having to go through the dungeons again. A good tactic that I used was to explore dungeons for treasure first, and then once you feel the end is near, turn around and leave to heal and save, then come back for the fight. This provides a small boost in levels, and also means you don't have to scour the dungeon for treasures again if you do get pulverised. Granted, knowing when the end of a dungeon is in sight can be tricky, and it's not really something that can be described in words, it's more a sixth sense that takes in layout, lighting and musical tone and raises a flag. As you progress through the game and get to grips with the scale of challenge that bosses are, it becomes much easier to appreciate the dungeons. You don't feel too cheated if you lose, but you still need to fight smart and be prepared. On reflection, I found the dungeons to be a solid feature of the game. Story elements seem to sit in the middle ground between the first game, with its thin plot and non-existent characters, and the second, which featured some developed characters and a strong narrative for the 8-bit era. I will be talking about some spoilers, so if you want to remain clear, skip ahead. In this game we do have characters, which also have canon names now. Luneth is an orphan, raised in the village of yes, that is its name. Bold and courageous, he does have an impulsive streak, often leading the party into situations regardless of the danger. Despite this, he is a natural leader, encouraging others and always being willing to help. Ark, an orphan, also raised in is Luneth's best friend. He is kind-hearted and intelligent, but lacks confidence and self-esteem, though he gradually gains those and goes on to help others in similar situations. Refia, an orphan, was raised in Kazus by the blacksmith Taka. While loving, he was insistent that Refia trains as a blacksmith, causing her to run away. She is passionate and more than willing to voice her thoughts on a situation, but is genuinely caring even if she does scold the others on occasion. Ingus, following the theme, is our fourth orphan. He was raised in Sassoon and eventually sweared fealty to the King of Sassoon. Ingus is the most mature of the group. He is responsible, loyal and determined. These four are our party, known as the Warriors of the Light. While they do have personalities, like the characters of Final Fantasy II, they lack true depth, likely for the same reason. With the job system offering so much flexibility, more expansive characterisation could potentially cause inconsistencies. The way the story is presented also doesn't give the characters much opportunity for really displaying their personality, as I'll cover soon. There are plenty of other characters too, and while many of them have some personality, their central story moments sometimes come across as a bit melodramatic, as if the game expects a greater degree of attachment from the player. The idea of guest characters returns, though instead of full party members they act more like random summons in battle, occasionally dropping in at the start of a turn. Narratively, one decent touch is some optional scenes with these guest characters that you can watch at your leisure. They offer up a bit more characterisation or background knowledge, or at the very least give you a hint of what to do next. These scenes can vary depending on location, so it's worth occasionally checking them. The Mognet feature, originally designed to use the DS's Wi-Fi connection, also allows you to receive letters from certain characters that often form small subplots. Following one of these will earn you the Onion Knight job, while others may lead to special weapons. As far as narrative content is concerned, A few of the characterising tidbits are interesting, but by no means essential. The villains are also a bit of a mixed bag. Some of them have clear and, if not reasonable, at least conceivable motivations. You'd probably be a bit salty too if your gift was mortality while your mates got epic magical powers. Unfortunately, most of the minor villains continue to reside in the evil for the sake of it category. The biggest issue with much of the character content has its root in the structure of the overall narrative. On the face of it, the story is very similar to that of the first game. 4 crystals keeping balance in the world have lost their light, spreading darkness across the world and threatening its destruction. The 4 warriors of the light, this time, must come together, restoring balance to the crystals, using their power to push back the darkness and save the world. It's a thin, overarching plot, and mostly exists as a driving force for the characters. There isn't anything truly binding the characters to this plot though, other than them being the protagonists. Most of the actual narrative meat is within the sub-stories that happen along the way. This is where we get the character moments and personality. The trouble is, they're often totally disconnected from each other. Each sub-story acts almost like its own episode, with very little continuity between them beyond the central crystal mission, and even that seems to be forgotten at times. While the final mission does tie a few threads together, it is the only point of contact between many of the episodes. Through the game we have to break a Djinn's curse, stabilise the Tower of Owen to save the floating continent, deal with a rogue thief, save the Kingdom of Argus from an advisor turned usurper, restore time to the lower world, reclaim the Enterprise, resolve a civil war, and plenty more. Each individual episode is fairly solid. On the short side, occasionally due to the limitations imposed by the faithfulness to the Famicom version, but usually enough to keep your interest. The overall experience suffers though. The episodes aren't deep enough themselves to leave a full impression, and the general disconnect between them makes the main plot fade into the background as well. That's not to say that the game has a bad story. At no point was I bored, so it performs at least adequately. I just wish there was more there. Keeping in mind that this is still mostly faithful to the 8-bit era version, I'm willing to grant the developers a bit of slack. Given how much is in there, it is really rather impressive and has a depth far greater than many games from the time. From a modern point of view though, it does fall a little short of the mark. Before we consider the presentation of the remade version, I will briefly talk about the Famicom version, as it has some interesting qualities. The menu interfaces have received minor changes from Final Fantasy II. The layout has been rearranged and will be familiar to anybody who has played any of the later games. Final Fantasy III essentially codified how menus would look throughout the series. The same is true for the battle system. Every element is in the position it would hold for the future. The text boxes are still here, still popping into existence, but battle information such as damage numbers is also displayed on the sprites themselves, another aspect that will become ubiquitous. A neat touch that we don't get to see again thanks to the large battle system changes that will be introduced in the Super Nintendo era is the target indicators on enemy sprites, showing which monsters are being targeted by which party member. The selected actions of previous characters are also displayed in the battle stats window, a handy little feature in case you accidentally select the wrong action. It isn't mere aesthetic changes though. Auto-targeting was introduced, ironically making the target indicators marginally less useful than they would have been in the earlier entries. Items are also used from the shared inventory now, no more having to equip them to specific party members. It isn't too hyperbolic to say that Final Fantasy III is the first true Final Fantasy as far as the most common features are concerned. Jumping forward to 2006's DS release, obviously many changes were made, The game now utilises 3D models instead of sprites, and the soundtrack got a decent revamp, though the DS cartridge size resulted in somewhat limited quality. Obviously, the two screens of the DS had an impact, with story content often spanning both. However, for much of the game, only the bottom screen is really utilised. On the overworld, the top screen plays host to a world map, but within dungeons and battles, the top screen remains blank. Whether this stemmed from a lack of ideas for the second screen or some forethought towards possible future ports is unknown, but it does make the DS version feel slightly underwhelming. I'll skip over many of the ports. General rule of thumb is slightly better graphics or sound each release. And given that the PC, Android and iOS versions are now practically identical, I'll throw them in together. Visually, they are all of high quality, with the 2020 update allowing the game to run natively in higher resolutions. The only downside is the 3D models themselves are still rather low poly. The amount of effort to remodel all of the characters and enemies would be considerable, so it's understandable why such a project wasn't undertaken. The art style itself does help to mitigate this downside, and by no means is the game an eyesore. The soundtrack is up to full CD quality for the up-to-date versions, and is rather pleasant. Occasionally there are issues with the loudness balance. The castle track is most guilty of this, not helped by its rather repetitive nature, but it stands out all the more against the rest of the soundtrack being pretty much ideal. The exclusivity factor does come into play as far as memorable tracks are concerned. There are few that one would recognise now, but as a whole package the soundtrack supports the game successfully. The biggest differences between the modern versions come in the form of the interfaces. Obviously, the Android and iOS versions are built around touch-friendly interfaces, and originally the PC version used that same interface, despite the game not supporting a mouse. This was a major source of complaints about the PC version, as the interfaces were awkward to navigate with a controller or keyboard. The 2020 update addressed this, not only adding mouse support, but also redesigning the menu. Well, not so much redesigning, but reversion to how it was laid out in the DS version. This is much easier to navigate with a controller, and the mouse support works like the touchscreens of the smartphone versions. On the overworld, it even utilises the same on-screen joystick. The update also vastly improved controller compatibility for the smartphone versions too, something they had been lacking. Essentially, the menu interface is the only difference between PC and smartphones in terms of game function. Which you may opt to play may depend on other factors, but first, let's consider the game as a whole. Is Final Fantasy III worth your time? Out of the first 3 games, this is the one I can best recommend. While the story may not be as gripping as Final Fantasy II's, the rest of the game more than makes up for it. The gameplay is by far the strongest, with the job system providing plenty of variety and also considerations of long-term strategy without locking you into a set of classes at the start. And while I have voiced some disappointment about the overworld and story content, it's more a case of wanting there to be more, because what is there is engaging and worthwhile. The difficulty can be a touch on the hard side at times, but the times where grinding is truly necessary are relatively few. And on the modern editions, the auto battle certainly makes the process less painful. At roughly 30 to 35 hours of gameplay to run through the main story, it isn't an extreme time sink, but isn't fleeting either. Nothing about the game overstays its welcome, and the staggered unlocking of new jobs refreshes your interest throughout the course of the game. To surmise, Final Fantasy III is a great addition of the series, and well worth playing if you want to experience a classic form of RPG, while still being recognisable as the Final Fantasy that comes to most people's minds. As to which version you should play, it's a fairly simplistic breakdown. The Famicom original suffers the same fate as the original version of Final Fantasy II. Being exclusive to Japan, actually playing it legitimately in the West is extremely difficult, and there is no official translation of this version either. The DS version, while the birth of the remake, is hampered by the fact that the Nintendo Wi-Fi connection has been shut down, rendering the Mognet content unusable. While none of it is essential, it is still content that is now lost. Later versions don't require connecting to anything to unlock the side quests, so they don't lose any content. As for which one to go for, it almost comes down to what device you own and your preferred way to play. The Android and iOS versions are portable and with improved controller support don't require the touchscreen, though the interfaces are still touch focused. The PC version is the easiest to play on a bigger screen and has interfaces that are designed for use with a controller. But, on the whole, I can't recommend any specific version. It is entirely up to you. That was Final Fantasy III. A great way to wrap up the 8-bit era, and though not so well known, it is the game that codified a surprising amount of common Final Fantasy elements. Alas, we must keep on moving. With a doubling of bits and everything turning rather super, our next task is Final Fantasy IV, from the top.